Man, Ukraine, it's relentless, isn't it?
Yeah, the situation there, it's so dynamic, so unpredictable.
You've got these big swings, like Ukraine making a push into Kursk, actually gaining some ground. You think maybe things are shifting?
Right, a glimmer of hope, perhaps?
And then, bam, Russia comes back with a vengeance, retaking those areas. And through it all, I mean, the attacks on both sides, they're just brutal. It's hard to even process sometimes.
The human cost is it's staggering.
And then, right in the middle of all this, you get this U.S.-backed 30-day ceasefire proposal. And Putin, he's saying things that sound,
Oh, yeah.
surprisingly positive.
On the surface, yeah, you think, is this a turning point?
But then he lays out these conditions, and they're not exactly small asks.
Tough new conditions, they're calling them.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly.
It's a situation ripe for a deep dive, wouldn't you say? Especially with all the information you've pulled together.
Absolutely. We need to untangle this ceasefire proposal. Is this really a path to peace? Or is this, I don't know, could this actually backfire and make things even worse for Ukraine?
That's the core question, isn't it? Is this a genuine opportunity to step back from the brink or a dangerous concession?
Exactly. And to even begin to answer that, we need to understand where things stand right now, this fragile balance everyone's talking about. What does that actually look like?
Look, from what you've gathered,
Yeah.
it's a very precarious situation, a lot of moving pieces. You've got the U.S. with President Trump out there giving it his full backing,
Yeah.
talking about a chance for lasting peace. That carries some weight, obviously.
Took time. And then you have Putin on the other side. He's calling the ceasefire idea great and correct. Which sounds good,
Ooh.
right? I mean, those are positive words.
They are, but then he attaches those conditions. Ukraine has to halt their mobilization, and the West, well, we have to completely stop sending weapons. That changes things.
Yeah, those are huge demands. And it puts Ukraine in a tough spot, right? I mean, they've agreed to the ceasefire, but they're doing it after those territorial losses in Kursk, which, we were just talking about how Russia was pushing back.
Exactly. They're negotiating from a position of weakness, having just lost ground. So it's like, how much are they willing to concede to get this pause in the fighting?
And it's not just happening in a vacuum, right? The whole world is watching, and it seems like everyone has a different opinion on this ceasefire.
You're absolutely right. You've got the UK, the EU, NATO. They're all putting on a show of unity, saying they're all on the same page.
Yeah.
But if you dig a little deeper into some of those sources you've got, I bet you find a much more complicated picture.
Oh, I'm sure. Everyone's got their own interests, their own angles. Okay, so let's break it down. What are the most compelling arguments for this ceasefire? What's the best case scenario here?
Well, I think the most powerful argument, and this comes through loud and clear in everything you sent over, is the humanitarian situation. 3 years of war. It's taken a horrific toll. Civilians trapped in these frontline cities, casualties mounting on both sides. A ceasefire, even if it's temporary, it would allow for humanitarian aid to get through. Medical care, evacuations, it would be a lifeline for so many people.
No question. That's the immediate impact, right? You can't argue with saving lives. And what about the military situation? I mean, could this help prevent Ukraine from losing even more territory, especially with what's been happening in Kursk?
That's another key argument in favor. Remember, Russia was able to recapture those towns, Sudzha being one of them, and they're claiming they've even isolated some Ukrainian troops. So the thinking is a ceasefire would essentially freeze the lines right where they are. It would stop the bleeding, at least for the moment, and give Ukraine time to regroup and, hopefully get more support from the international community.
Sort of a timeout to strategize. And what about the possibility of using this pause to jumpstart negotiations, actual diplomatic talks? I mean, is there any hope for that?
You know, Past attempts haven't gone anywhere, but there's a sense, and some of your sources touch on this, that the current environment might be different. You've got those back-channel discussions that the U.S. has reopened with Moscow, plus you have those special envoys running around. So maybe, just maybe, a ceasefire could create enough breathing room to build some trust, or at least, enough to allow for some real dialogue to take place. It's a long shot, but it's a possibility.
And of course, this war has had such a massive impact on the global economy. Everything from energy prices to food supplies, it's all been disrupted.
Oh, absolutely. You look at what's happening in Europe, the energy markets are all over the place. And then you have those grain exports from Ukraine that have been basically cut off, creating food shortages in certain parts of the world. A ceasefire, even if it's just for 30 days, it could bring some stability to those markets. And maybe, just maybe, help ease some of the pressure on prices globally.
So a little bit of relief on that front too, potentially. And it's interesting, if you think about it from the U.S. perspective, this ceasefire, it could be, I don't know, a way to kind of reframe their role in the conflict, couldn't it?
I think that's a really insightful point. For the current administration, if they can pull this off, it allows them to position themselves as peacemakers, the ones who brought everyone to the table. That could have huge implications both domestically and internationally. It could even help them push through some of their other priorities, maybe free up some resources. It's all about framing, isn't it?
Sure. But let's be real, there are some big concerns about the ceasefire, some serious downsides we have to address. Where do we even begin?
Well, the biggest one, the one that keeps coming up again and again, and I'm
Yeah.
sure your sources highlight this, is that the ceasefire could end up rewarding Putin for his aggression.
Right, because he's the one who initiated the invasion in the first place.
Right. Exactly. And right now, he's in a position of strength. He's just made these gains in Kursk, and a ceasefire would let him hold onto that territory, solidify his control. Critics argue that this sends the dangerous message that you can invade a sovereign country, seize land, and then get rewarded for it with a ceasefire.
Almost like it legitimizes the whole thing. It sets a terrible precedent. And
Yeah.
then you have Putin's demands, which, let's be honest, they're pretty outrageous.
Yeah, halting Ukrainian mobilization, stopping all Western arms shipments. I mean, come on. These aren't just conditions for a ceasefire, they're demands for surrender.
Mm.
And they raise a huge red flag. Is Putin really interested in peace? Or is he just trying to exploit this situation to weaken Ukraine even further, making it impossible for them to defend themselves in the future?
It feels like a trap, doesn't it? And then there's the whole question of Ukrainian sovereignty. Accepting a ceasefire under these terms after already losing territory, it doesn't look good.
It would be a blow, no doubt about it. And it would put Zelensky in a terrible position. He'd be facing pressure from all sides, accused of giving in, of selling out. And it would really undermine Ukraine's standing on the international stage. They've been fighting so hard for their independence, their right to determine their own future. This ceasefire could jeopardize all of that.
It could almost be seen as a surrender. And then, we can't ignore the possibility of this becoming another frozen conflict, like what we've seen in other parts of the former Soviet Union.
Exactly. You look at places like Georgia, Moldova, where you have these breakaway regions that are essentially under Russian control. The fear is that Putin's playing a long game here, that he's not necessarily aiming for a full-scale takeover of Ukraine, but rather to create these frozen conflicts, these festering wounds that he can use to destabilize the country and prevent it from ever truly integrating with the West.
A constant thorn in Ukraine's side. And this all circles back to the U.S. and their motivations. I mean, are they really acting in Ukraine's best interests here?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There's a lot of skepticism out there, and some of it is directed at President Trump. Critics argue that he's so desperate for a win, for something he can tout as a foreign policy success, that he's willing to push Ukraine into a deal that might not be in their long-term interests. They worry he's putting domestic politics ahead of Ukraine's security, and that's a dangerous game to play.
Yeah, there's a lot at stake here. So, as we look ahead, what are the biggest unknowns, the things that could really swing this one way or the other?
Well, for me, the biggest question mark hanging over all of this is Putin. What are his real intentions?
Yeah.
Does he actually want a negotiated settlement? Or is this ceasefire just a way to buy time, regroup, and eventually launch a new offensive? That's something we just can't know for sure.
He's a tough one to read. And then, of course, there's the question of whether Ukraine's allies will hold firm.
Yeah, the unity of the West is going to be absolutely crucial. Will they continue to provide Ukraine with the military and financial support they need? Or will they start to waver, maybe put pressure on Zelensky to accept a deal that's not in his best interests? That's something we need to watch very closely.
And Zelensky himself, he's got a tough road ahead, doesn't he?
He's in an impossible position. He has to find a way to protect his people, stand up for his country's sovereignty, and somehow navigate all the competing pressures from the international community. It's a huge burden to carry.
And then there's the military situation itself. I mean, if this ceasefire collapses, things could get very ugly very quickly.
Absolutely. Will Ukraine have used this pause to rebuild their defenses, strengthen their positions? Or will Russia have taken advantage of it to prepare for a new attack? That's a huge unknown, and it could determine the course of the entire war.
And we can't forget about the people, both in Ukraine and around the world. Public opinion, that's a powerful force, isn't it?
It is. How will Ukrainians react to this ceasefire? Will they see it as a betrayal? or a necessary step to save lives? And what about the international community? Will they continue to support Ukraine? Or will they start to lose interest? As the conflict drags on, public pressure could play a huge role in how this all unfolds.
So in the end, we're left with this fundamental question. Is this ceasefire, this U.S.-backed proposal, a chance for peace? Or is it a dangerous gamble?
That's the dilemma, isn't it? A chance for peace, a chance to stop the bloodshed, to start talking again, but also a risk, a real risk that it could play right into Putin's hands, that it could leave Ukraine vulnerable, and that it could make a lasting peace even harder to achieve.
And what's so fascinating about this whole situation, for me at least, is that there's no easy answer. It's not black and white. There are valid arguments on both sides.
And that's what makes this such a compelling deep dive, right? By going through all these different perspectives, by really analyzing the information you've been given, you're getting a much clearer picture of the complexities involved. You're seeing the full spectrum of possibilities, both the hopeful and the terrifying.
So I'm going to put this to you, our listener. What do you think? After hearing all of this, what do you believe is the most likely outcome? Will this ceasefire lead to a lasting peace? Or will it just prolong the suffering, make things even worse in the long run? And what are the things we haven't even considered, those wild cards that could completely change the game? There's a lot to think about, and the stakes, they couldn't be higher.